Well, amen. John Rule, read us something from your recent work. It's the 20th of January 2014 recording, and there you go. Here we are, and so you can actually read for about 28 minutes without stopping if you choose.
Very good.
In this segment here.
All right, this is from Wild Iris, which is section 7 of Nomads, and it covers the years 1943 through 45 in Baxter County, Arkansas, in the vicinity of Norfolk Dam, which was just being finished. Wild Iris. In the last days of 1942, they reached the dam site in the night over gravel roads. Some local informant directed T.M., my father, to the east or the inaccessible side of the dam. They stumbled out in a cleared space with a few cabins, always after referred to simply as Hilltop, and stumbled into one to get bedded down, as with so many night arrivals that Jay recalled. In the morning, when Jay woke early and curious, his dad was already gone, and the roar from the dam site was loud, though blocked partly by the high ridge and the sheer rock bluff on this side where it was anchored. Jay knew nothing of all this when he first stepped out and gazed around. It seemed to him they were in a strange, primitive place. He was facing to the north and east where a big lake arm ran a long way, with stark timbered ridges outlined in snow. Where he stood was so high he could see everywhere except for the wooded ridge end behind him. Below and to the left lay the main lake body, likely the old riverbed, coming from the north. A raw border of cut-off desolation surrounded the blue water and showed that the level was only a third or so of what it might finally rise to. A keen flow of frigid air stung his cheeks. He gingerly traipsed out to the road on the inch or two of snow and turned toward the rise and fall of construction noise. The road scrape ended abruptly at brush and a fringe of trees through which he could dimly see the far part of the rising dam, a long gray line. His ears burned from the cold. He covered them with his hands as he cut over the knob to the southwest on crunchy leaves and snow, hunting for an open vantage point. He reached one where the knob dropped toward a side hollow's junction with the river. The slope was slippery, and he had to cling to a sapling. Here the full blast of concentrated human workplace struck him, much more than when he went on the big airfield at Mobile. He clung and stared. Below and beyond, the staggered rising sections of the gray barrier stretched at least a third of a mile. Men in shiny work helmets swarmed atop it, while taut cables swung, rose and fell, delivering steel rod and dripping concrete buckets to the nearby sections. Blue-white fire spat busily from welders. Below, the shrunken river lay in shallow pools of clear water, above a blackened rocky bottom. Clumps and mats of more black stuff floated on the surface. Across the river, beyond a scraped gravel plain, a rail track led to the site, and monster trucks roared into pyramids of gravel and sand and conveyors and pipes at the metal mixing towers. His dad must be somewhere in all of that, one of those tiny active man figures. It was too much to stay with. He carefully turned and half crawled to safer ground and back to the road end. He noted a path across from the cabins he might later take down to the lake inlet. The sun was burning through a weak overcast and the thin snowfall melting underfoot. He was glad to get into the warm cabin. In just a few hours, the day changed to milder and sunny. He went out again. Across the road, a narrow dozer scrape held soft and creamy clay. He tried molding a leaping trout figure from it and laid it to dry on a sunny rock. Then he took to the path downslope toward the water. In a short while on the twisty trail, he dropped into the bare, logged-off lake basin, a desert of rock ledges, crevices, fresh stumps already bleached, tiny caulked pools of organic rubble, gravel, sand, hunks of chert or flint with geodes in them. Soon he came down to the end of a tail of water, an inlet with flat, craggy ledges on both sides. Sawdust and woody flotsam covered the water at the very end. At the edge of the floating mat was the water lay pellucid and sterile looking. He leapt across a tiny drain of snow water seeping in. He stood to stare across the metallic sheen of the lake. At his level, the ice island that floated in the center barely showed. Then at his feet, something odd caught his eye, a tusk-like shape, maybe 9 inches long. He lifted it and studied it closely. It was stone and seemed as smooth as bone, but heavy. To his romantic vision, it seemed it must be from something like a saber-toothed cat. He wedged it carefully, brought in first into a hip pocket, and then began to search excitedly for more strange and wonderful things. He found nothing else like the tooth or whatever it was, but went on until he suddenly realized how dry and hungry he was down in this bare, sheltered basin. He turned back and was soon racing up the path to tell of his find. At the trailhead, he checked his clay trout figure and found it had dried too fast on the surface and cracked up. Then he felt for his tooth fossil. It was gone. He panicked and raced back down the trail, scanning both sides of the path and everywhere he'd gone after the find. An hour later, he plodded wearily back to the cabins, but resolved to search again. He never found it. A few days later, TM moved them around to the west, to the accessible side of the dam site, and into an unpainted and unused new building up a side valley and on the only road to the dam site. The work site itself was perhaps 2/3 of a mile away, down a long slope toward the river valley and out of sight behind the ridge end. Opposite and uphill a short distance was a 3-way junction with the roads from Norfolk and Mountain Home. Mammoth Euclid trucks with ribbed dump beds roared to and from the work area in clouds of dust. Cabins of pine lumber covered with tar paper sat along the road and spotted the ridge that blocked the view of the dam. This was Ellis, the worker village. Immediately above the line of small buildings, a spring of water welled up through a layer of gray limestone with sandstone cap rock above it. A low concrete wall around the spring was breached by a jagged hole at the bottom to let out the flow. This branch ran a few feet behind the cabins, paralleling the road and the wooded rocky ridge that made the north side of the valley. The building they moved into was clearly intended as a combination store and billiard parlor. Large plate glass windows faced the world, and a used metal Coke sign with the legend Parker Pool Room lay atop a pile of leftover lumber against one wall. A local entrepreneur from Norfolk owned this building and much of the area. By now, with the dam already half built, Ellis itself was a case of overbuilding for a worker boom that never came. The dam swarmed with workers during the shifts, but most commuted. Jay's family moved into the cramped living quarters behind the big front room. All was bare, unpainted pine lumber. Lone light bulbs hung on single cords. A spindly back stoop with high steps looked down on the noisy spring branch in the foot of the rising ridge slope. TM parked the trailer alongside the building and piled some of his tools inside. A few feet on the other side was a white frame house with another worker family, the Dunns. Jay quickly got friendly with their kids, an older girl and her brothers, or rather she quickly took over. "Hi, I'm Lena Dunn. Are you going to live here? What's your name? Does your dad work at the dam?" Her two brothers looked just like little Herbie in the comic strip, long, bulgy-jawed heads with deeply dimpled chins and almost albino hair, really no eyebrows, and odd-shaped blue eyes. Lena had the odd-shaped eyes as well, sky blue like her mother and brothers. Both she and her mom had battered-looking features, oily complexions, and limp dishwater hair with soup bowl haircuts. Both had good figures, though. By now, the life process of arousal that started for him with his pretty fifth-grade teacher in Mobile reached a level of intense waking awareness. He was curious and focused on all girls and women now. He'd begun to explore his sex feelings by fondling his genitals in the bath back in Harrison. Guilt and sin clung to him each time. He vividly recalled the story of the boy who cut off his penis, but felt driven, unable to hold back. This urge came over him after he read in the French novels. To him, it seemed totally different from his love for his blonde idol in Harrison. That drew his whole being from the first, a young, dumb brute, transfixed by his first vision of female human beauty. This was physical and immediate male body hunger that bothered him. He worried about it. He couldn't help when some happening triggered it. Already their first evening here after his family moved in, he was in the big windowed room as darkness fell, absently gazing up the road to Salesville. At once, light went on in the Dunn's kitchen a few feet away, and he saw Lena and her brothers milling around, ready for supper. Then Mrs. Dunn stepped into the middle, smooth and naked. Below her potato facial features, she was curved and beautiful. The kids all laughed at her. She made some remark, laughed, and lifted a flannel nightie to shrug into it, then moved out of sight. What stunned Jay was his instant double reaction, repugnance to the face and attraction to the body alone. How could that be? Anyway, she was a married lady with kids his age. He pondered it a bit, then shrugged and forgot it.
John, a question, if you'll take a second.
Sure.
Do you take your coffee with cream or black?
I take it either way.
Which do you prefer?
I prefer cream or milk, something to whiten it.
I've got sweetener. Do you want some of that?
No, I don't need any sweetener.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Well, sorry to break your thread there, but
that's fine.
You might need a sip of something.
Yes, it helps. This is dry work. In the next day or so, Jay eagerly scouted the immediate area, the spring and its splashing branch behind the cabins, and even part of the ridge across the road, which rose gradually across an unused pasture to an abrupt line that marked the river ridge. From an open break in the timber line, he could see a long stretch of the river valley and a long island. In his rambles, he spotted a half-dried clump of short, woody growth that still held some fuzzy, BB-sized berries. They were hard and dried up, so he went on. He didn't think to wash his hands and later had to pee. They were poison oak berries. After he recovered from a night of itchy agony, there was still time before school resumed after New Year's. He looked around for a project. He wandered around the big commercial room where scraps lay piled. The river's narrowness excited him as he stared at the 9 by 3 foot Coke sign full of nail holes from its previous venue. Feeling guilty and asking no one, he decided to make a metal canoe of it, like the one his young uncles made of sheet iron back on the Spring Creek farm in Kansas. From the stack of scraps, he selected 2 short boards for prow and stern, 2 short pieces for thwarts, and 2 long strips for gunnels. He got hammer and tools from his dad's toolbox and set to work cutting, bending, and hammering. This resulted in a dory-like shape, but with stem and stern tilted toward each other. He pounded the outer metal edges in and curled them over the gunwale strips, then installed the thwarts. He smeared tar on the nail holes from inside, then cut patches from half-rotted canvas to stick on the tar. All this activity roused the curiosity of another new friend, tall, thin Jack, whose family lived in 2 cabins across the road. This frail-looking but strong kid helped Jay carry his new creation down the road and across the gravel plain to the river, where they slid it into the water at the first creek below the roaring dam activity. Though mostly cut off, the river still held a bit of current from 2 little side streams. Jay was nervous about the makeshift boat. What if it turned over or leaked like a sieve? He got in gingerly and sat flat on the bottom. All of the patches held. Despite some tippiness, the awkward-looking craft drew only an inch or 2 of water, and Jay skimmed around triumphantly with a paddle whittled from aboard. Jack danced and waved from the bank and laughed about the Parker pool room legend boldly above the waterline. While Jack followed along on the bank, Jay paddled down to the mouth of the branch from Ellis, where they pulled it out and turned it over in the thicket, tossing dead vines and ragweed debris on to conceal it. Jay now felt he'd done something, opened a vista of joyous exploring. This dented metal craft was his magic carpet, one part of his new life. Already his settled life in Harrison and the image of his dear coltish love seemed dim and far off, hopeless and not to be mourned much, just another closed but unforgotten remnant of their rootless, restless life. Now school started up. He must finish his 6th grade, get used to this new school like the one-room school he'd attended again just once since they let him doodle in his tablet at age 5 in Kansas. The building was a half-mile up the road from Ellis in the tiny road junction community of Salesville. Here a low-white general store was parked in a wide area of gravel surrounded by 3 farms and a few small dwellings. The school itself sat some yards back from the road at the edge of its large yard with a fringe of woods right behind. Jay's fate had been always to be the new kid in far too many schools by now, but he quickly realized he'd never known kids like this mix of children from hill families and down workers. Nor was the building itself similar to the one on the corner of the home farm, aside from his and hers whitewashed privies and an outside pump. As with many hill communities, it seemed to be planned for use at both school and church. Its single entrance was up high steps and through a narrow anteroom below its cupola and bell tower. Inside, blackboards lined the north side of the room. Large, clear, draw-sash windows filled the east and west sides. 8 rows of desks faced the teacher's desk against the south wall. No paintings of Washington or Lincoln graced the walls. There was no U.S. flag, except for the pot-bellied stove and its tools in the center. The only other notable fixture was a horizontal rack for 2 whipping rods on the wall behind the teacher's desk. It was empty. The pupils in the 8 grades ranged from tots to swaggering young men. Jay's brother Matt and other littlies sat on the front line of deskless seats facing the teacher, a very pale-skinned brunette young woman who punched one cheek with her pencil a lot as she pondered her grade book. The older girls, possibly a dozen, occupied the row of desks along the west wall. From this segregated area, they brazenly flirted and eyed the bigger boys assigned to the east wall and the back half of the room beyond the stove in the center. The tallest and oldest males seemed to gain courage through their distance from the teacher. When her attention was on the 1st grade, they smirked knowingly at the big girls, passed notes, and shot wet paper wads at one another from elderberry stem pop guns. All this had to take place below desk level, of course. Jay was both intrigued and appalled by all this mess of activity while school was in session. Through his lateral spying, the pop gun battles improved his peripheral vision mightily. No more than a pair of duelists engaged at one time, too risky otherwise. Each shooter's weapon was a section of smooth elderberry stem with the pith punched out and a knob-handled plunger that just fit the hole, made of dogwood or hickory. These marksmen would sit bolt upright at their desk, wearing faint grins as they chewed slyly but diligently at scraps torn from their school tablets. With a plunger, they would carefully force a masticated mass into the shooter barrel part way, then withdrew the plunger and forced in a second, leaving an airspace between. Ideally, with the plunger poised carefully behind the second wad and the barrel angled at the victim across the aisle, a sudden jar on the plunger while the teacher was distracted would send a soppy missile across and smack against the cheek or temple of the target. A chewing and reloading race came next, since retaliation was both needful and expected. To Jay, all this surreptitious upright munching was like rabbits on the lawn in early morning, rapidly reducing dandelion stems. Confiscations took place almost daily, but replacements were easy to make and hide under overalls and jeans. The ringleader of this back row gang was a well-muscled, jet-haired young buck named Clevis, who strode about with a surly, darkly grinning air. His family's dilapidated farmhouse sat next to the schoolyard fence. Part of their farm pond extended beyond the fence. Except in class, Clevis sported a large, broad-brimmed black Carlsbad, he especially prized. His main amusement after school was to put on his hat and gallop the family workhorse up and down the road in front of the school, a la Roy Rogers. About the second week after Jay enrolled, the whole school came down with pertussis, whooping cough. If anything comic happened, and something always did, the burst of laughter would morph into painful suckings and wheezings, then more nervous laughter and gasping until suddenly the whole group would scramble out onto the packed dirt of the schoolyard, bent double and wheezing like living croquet wickets. Of games and athletic equipment, there was only one game to play, Red Rover or Annie Over, and one pocked red sponge rubber ball to play it with. One of the strongest boys was picked as captain for each opposing side, who then took turns choosing up, and then who would go first, rough or smooth. The winning captain would call out the opening phrase and hurl the ball over the roof to the other side, after which both teams would rush around to the opposing side through each other, dodging furiously to escape the ball thrown by the enemy captain. A hit would transfer the victim to the other team. The cupola bell for school to resume would signal the end of the game and victory for the larger group. Jay hated this game for its pell-mell confusion, and because he once was badly hurt, hit solidly in the groin by a chunky black-haired girl who bounced off and ran on blithely while he doubled over that peculiar hollow stomach pain. But after all, Jay had to admit that he'd had no new boy fights here, and there was no big school impersonality, no fears of where to go and which bus to find to get home, no scorn from the teachers for being a transient child. With the advent of a sudden pre-spring weather front one Friday came a soft fuzzing shower that passed, then an infusion of warm, moist air later. An organic perfume of rebirth rose from the soil. Jay felt restless and full of energy after school. Hardly knowing why, he ran up the path to the schoolyard before dusk. Other kids were there too. Even two boy-girl couples, arm in arm, sauntering around the schoolyard and pausing at the edge of the debris-filled farm pond. Toads crowded the water's edge and rode on every piece of floating board, whirring away with throats puffed out like pale gum bubbles. Chorus frogs nickered and rattled a reply from the wooded draw behind the school. A few early fireflies made neon green exclamations above dead weeds in the fence row. It was all magical. With the weather change, TM took the family fishing overnight at the mouth of the North Fork. On a Friday, they piled in after work with the usual meager supplies for camping, a tarp and ropes, a few tools, coffee pot and fry pan, an old oven grill for the fire. Vida shoved in a couple of army blankets and a sack with coffee and tea, eggs and bread for breakfast. They left after a light meal, drove the 3 miles and down off the steep approach to the Norfolk Bridge and onto the flat upstream point between the rivers. TM picked a spot for their fire a few yards off the track and right on the riverbank. The railroad bridge loomed high and near. Just downstream, the North Fork merged with the larger river, the White, in a wavering line of whirlpools with sucking sounds. There wasn't much growth left to explore right here, with old fields and railroad behind and much of the point and overflow area, but Jay and the kids helped carry firewood from drifts along the bank while TM built the fire. Vida was nervous about the kids. Here the dirt bank sloped steeply into the water. TM started the fire quickly, then he and Jay began bottom fishing with bait, casting halfway or more across the North Fork slow current, letting the line lie motionless. Evening drew near, and a light mist of small rain began to sift down on them. The thin line of larger trees scattered along the water and barely showing bud color provided no shelter. Vida and the kids huddled at the fire. TM quickly cut prop forks for the rods and left them pointing skyward. He tugged a sizable section of driftwood log from a pile, lugged it to the fire, and dropped it to one side. "Is that for the fire, Daddy?" Dave asked. TM made them all get away from the fire, pulled on his gloves, and took the grill and the drink cans off it. "That's your pillow," he said, and fetched a shovel and an axe from the car. He scooped up all the fire embers and rebuilt the fire 6 feet closer to the riverbank. He scraped the scorched area carefully, then fetched the heavy olive drab tarp and spread half of it on the hot earth. He laid the log section carefully across the top and pulled the end across the tarp and pulled the end down over the log and down even with the bottom edge. He cut stakes fast and drove them at the corners of the tarp, lifted the top layer and fastened it to the stakes with light rope through the grommet holes. He tautened and staked the rope ends, then spread one of the army blankets inside and over the log. He now had a crude baker tent, a V on its side, with the open end toward the fire. "Now crawl in there, you rascals," he said. "Prop your heads on the log and let the heat come up and bake your backsides." It was about time. The rain was a little harder, but still part mist. When Jay crept inside with Vida and the kids, heat had already come up through the tarp and the wool blanket. The rain made small papping sounds above them. The second blanket was tossed in, and they all helped spread it. TM renewed the fire in front with drift chunks placed teepee style. The fire hissed some, but kept on, bouncing warmth onto them. They slept well while TM watched the lines off and on through the night, hunched up in his canvas field coat and Jones duck hunting cap, and drank black coffee. At last he too turned in, having caught nothing. At 5 of a mist-rising morning, they reeled in their lines. Jay's was heavy and inactive, but did yield. "I'm hooked on a log or a turtle," he called, grunting as he pumped and reeled. But it was a channel catfish, a fiddler, speckled on his tannish silvery sides and held in a semicircle by Jay's second hook. It weighed 3 pounds, so they could all have a taste. In February, TM had a local blacksmith that his boss, Dub Eason, knew to make him a gig head, a heavy trident spear forged to spear fish in these rock-bottom rivers. When the March freshets came, Dub and TM went out one night with carbide headlamps to gig suckers in a small feeder branch over the ridge from Ellis. They took Jay to drag the tow sack behind. Jay had roamed this stream in daylight with the Dunn boys, but this was different. This time he had no light as he slogged along in the rainy dark. The lights confused and blinded him as they switched around while the two busy men jabbed and laughed ahead. Dub swore loudly each time he missed a silvery bullet of a panicked fish. Both kept shoving the big scale suckers into the tow sack he dragged until he began to slip and flounder so much that he called out to them for a halt. At that, the two did stop. They laughed and decided they'd done enough for one night. They carefully inspected the barbed tines of the gigs to see how blunted they were, then drove back to Dub's place on the ridge above Ellis, divided the catch and dressed them out on the hull of a cabin cruiser TM was helping Dub build. The boat looked clumsy to Jay compared to the beautiful boats at Mobile. Dub had a water hose there and hung a mechanic's trouble light over the clothesline. Mrs. Eason and Laney, the daughter, Jay's age, came out to watch briefly in the rain. Laney was a slim blonde daughter of Eve who was partly supplanting Jay's memory of his lost love. Laney had brothers, all copies of Dub, an attractive man except for his beer belly and dramatic profanity. All had Dub's spiky black hair and fine skin. Rob, the eldest, was a math whiz and friendly to Jay. Jay, in his usual crawfishy way, had never even dared to speak to Laney. The suckers were good eating despite their ugliness, big bony heads and vacuum cleaner mouths. They were filled with fine hair-like bones, but scored many times with a knife along the sides and fried crisp. They made a fine feast for Jay's family. Dub said he would do some in his oil barrel smoker. Spring came on, the sap rose, serviceberry trees flared white on ridge slopes, and white adder's tongues, tinged with mold, raised their modest heads like goose feathers along the school path. Wild bearded iris sent up their spears on creek banks, and forests of May apples unfurled in shady places. The sap rose indoors as